Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, we're all trying to get a handle on this whole AI trust thing, right? I mean, it's everywhere. And you guys want the real deal without wading through a sea of jargon. So today, we're going deep on a question that's top of mind for a lot of you. How can we actually make sure AI systems are trustworthy? Not just hope for the best, but like really ensure it.
Absolutely. And, folks are sending us some great research to dig into. You shared this recent study with us that just tackles this issue head on. It uses, get this, game theory.
Game theory. Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah, it's about looking at how different players in the AI world interact, like they're in a game, each with their own goals. They even use, wait for it, large language models to actually simulate those interactions.
Whoa, that's getting meta. So
Yes.
we're using AI to study AI trust. That's super cool. Tell me more about where this research is coming from.
Yeah, so it's coming out of some really respected institutions, places like the University of Birmingham, Teesside University, to name a few. What's cool is they're not just philosophizing about AI ethics here. They're building a model to try to get at the heart of what actually drives responsible AI and ultimately user confidence.
Okay, so let's talk more action. Sounds like my kind of research.
Yeah.
But real talk, why do you think this particular paper caught your eye? I mean, you probably have a mountain of AI papers landing in your inbox daily.
You're not wrong about that inbox, haha. But I think this one really resonated with the vibe of our community here. It's practical. You guys are thinking about the real world impact of all this. Like, how do we actually govern AI? What about all these debates swirling around regulation? And at the end of the day, how can we actually feel good about the AI that's increasingly part of our lives? This paper gets into all that.
Right on. It's all about cutting through the noise and getting to the actionable stuff. So what's the core of their argument? What are they saying about how we build trust in AI?
Well, they actually start by challenging a pretty common idea, the kind of thing you hear a lot. That transparency from the people building the AI and good, strong regulation from the authorities are like the magic ingredients for trustworthy AI. And once you have that, well, everyone will just jump on board and start using AI everywhere. Problem solved.
Yeah, I can see the logic there. If we know how AI works and there are rules in place, it seems like people would naturally trust it more. So what's the catch? Why are they pushing back against this?
Because, well, as elegant as that idea sounds, it kind of misses the messiness of the real world. The fact that everyone involved, people making AI, the folks regulating it, even us, the users, we all have our own motivations. We're not always perfectly rational actors working towards some common good. And then on top of that, you've got this crazy complex flow of information around AI. So it's not just about like writing down some principles and calling it a day.
Right, because in real life, things are rarely that neat and tidy. So who are the key players in this system that this study is looking at? Who's driving this whole AI trust game?
They break it down into four main groups, which makes it a lot easier to visualize. First up, you've got your AI developers, the ones actually building the systems. And they're faced with a fundamental choice. Do they go all in on safety? This means investing the time, resources, effort, all of that, which, let's be real, costs money. They label that cost CP. Or do they cut corners, maybe prioritize speed over robustness, knowing that could lead to, well, unsafe AI? And the thing is, if they go down that unsafe path and get caught, there's a penalty. They call it U. So it's a trade-off between investing in safety upfront versus running the risk of getting slapped with a penalty later.
So developers are juggling investment versus risk. Makes sense. Who else is in the mix?
All right, next up, we've got the regulators, the folks setting the rules of the road for AI. They've also got some choices to make. Do they invest in building truly effective regulations? Again, that takes effort, expertise, resources. It has a cost, which they call CR. Or do they, phone it in? Maybe the regulations aren't as strong or as well enforced. Now, here's the thing. They get a benefit called BR when people actually adopt and use AI. It kind of makes sense their job looks more successful if people are buying into the whole AI thing. Plus, if they actually catch developers creating unsafe AI and successfully punish them, that's a win for them. That's represented as a reward before. But even handing out that punishment, actually enforcing the rules, takes work and has its own cost fee. So the regulators are balancing the upfront costs of good regulation against the benefits they get from AI adoption and the, let's say, administrative hassle of actually cracking down on bad actors.
Oh, okay. So the regulators have a lot on their plate. What about us, the everyday people who actually use AI? Where do we fit into all of this?
Right. So the users, that's us, we're the ones actually deciding whether or not to trust and use AI. In this model, we operate based on what they call conditional trust. Basically, we might decide to use AI if we see positive signals about it, like if the media is saying a particular AI is safe and effective, or maybe if our friends are using it and having good experiences. On the flip side, if we see red flags, or we just don't have enough information, we might decide to avoid AI altogether. Now, if we use AI and it turns out to be safe, great. We get a benefit, which they call BU, but there's always a chance that the AI might not be as safe as we thought. And that risk is represented by a factor they call epsilon, which basically reduces the benefit we get if the AI turns out to be risky.
So the users are making decisions based on the information they have,
Mhm.
and there's always that element of risk. Okay, that leaves us with the last group, the commentariat. That sounds kind of fancy. Who are they exactly?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, haha. Basically, the commentariat refers to the media, journalists, bloggers, all those voices that shape public opinion and understanding. Their big decision is whether to put in the work to really investigate AI, both the developers and the regulators, to give people accurate, well-informed advice. Obviously, that takes time, resources, expertise. They call that cost CI. But if their reporting is on point and they get things right, well, their reputation gets a boost. That's the benefit, labeled BI. But flip side, if they get it wrong, spread misinformation, well, their reputation takes a hit. That's the cost, CW. And even if they decide not to investigate at all, just report on surface level stuff, there's still a chance they'll get things wrong. They represent that as a probability, P to euro. So the media is kind of like a filter for information about AI, but they have their own skin in the game too.
Okay, so they're shaping the narrative, but they have to be careful about getting it right. It kind of sounds like they're acting as a sort of, what did the paper call it, soft regulation?
Exactly. They're not setting official rules like the regulators, but they can influence behavior by shining a light on what's going on. And the study points out two main ways they can do this. First, they can directly investigate the AI developers, look into their practices, their safety protocols, all that. This can act as a kind of pressure on developers to build safer systems even if there aren't strict regulations in place. The other way is to act as a watchdog on the regulators. Hold their feet to the fire, make sure they're actually doing their job effectively. So where the media focuses its attention can have a big ripple effect on the whole AI ecosystem.
Got it. Two very different but equally important roles for the media. Now, you mentioned that the study uses game theory to understand these interactions. For someone who's not familiar with that, can you break down how that works?
Sure. Think of game theory as a way to model how different players make decisions when the outcome depends on what other players do. It's strategic decision making. In this case, they used something called evolutionary game theory, or EGT, which is especially cool. You see, traditional game theory assumes that everyone's super rational, always calculating the absolute best move. But EGT is more realistic. It says, hey, in the real world, people and organizations don't always make perfect decisions. It looks at how different strategies, ways of acting, become more or less common over time based on how well they work for the players using them.
So it's less about finding the perfect strategy and more about understanding the dynamics that play out when everyone's trying to act in their own best interest, even if they don't always get it right.
Right. It's about how these strategies evolve. And this is especially helpful when you're dealing with a field like AI, which is changing so rapidly. We don't have tons of historical data to work with, so EGT lets us make predictions about what might happen in different scenarios based on how the incentives are set up.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a way to anticipate potential outcomes without needing a crystal ball. Yeah. Now, they also did something really cool with large language models, right? Didn't they use AI to actually simulate these interactions?
Yeah, they did. This is actually one of the most innovative parts of their approach. They took those four actors we talked about, developers, regulators, users, and the commentariat, and they represented each of them using an LLM. They used some pretty advanced ones too, like ChatGPT 4o and Mistral Large. They gave these LLMs prompts, like instructions, designed to mimic the goals and decision-making processes of each player. So it's like setting up a virtual AI world where you have these AI agents interacting based on the rules of the game.
I love that. It's like AI role-playing to figure out how AI trust might actually play out in the real world. So what kinds of questions were they trying to answer with this setup? What do they want to learn about this interplay between media, regulation, and trust?
Well, there were three main questions driving their research. First, they wanted to know, under what circumstances does really thorough investigation by the commentariat, so think in-depth reporting, real scrutiny, actually lead to more responsible AI development, better regulation, and ultimately more people feeling comfortable trusting and using AI? Second, they want to figure out what conditions would actually motivate a commentariat themselves to really dig deep and do that kind of investigation, whether it's looking at developers or regulators, because, as we said, they have their own incentives at play. And lastly, they wanted to see if it's more effective for the media to focus their investigations on the developers, the ones actually building AI, or on the regulators, the ones who are supposed to be overseeing it all, because those are two very different approaches, each with its own potential impact.
Yeah, those are some big questions that get to the heart of the matter. So let's start with the simplest scenario. What did they find when they looked at what happens when the media or commentariat is assumed to be totally objective in its reporting? Like they're just stating the facts, no bias, no agenda.
Okay, so in that case, when the media is consistently reporting accurate information about how AI developers are behaving, are they prioritizing safety? Are they cutting corners? Things like that. The study found that this can actually lead to users trusting the signals they're getting from the media. And here's a really interesting point, that trust in the media can potentially reduce the need for super strict, what they call hard regulation.
Wait, so if people trust the media to tell them which AI is safe, they might not need as many rules from the government. That's kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, it is. But it makes sense if you think about it. If users have a reliable source of information about which developers are building safe, responsible AI, they can make informed choices about which AI to use and which to avoid. This can take some of the pressure off the regulators to create and enforce a ton of rules.
So a well-informed public can potentially self-regulate to some extent.
Interesting. What about when the media is reporting objectively, but their focus is on the regulators? Like they're scrutinizing how well the government is doing its job overseeing AI. What happens then? In that scenario where the media is objectively reporting on the regulators' performance, the study found that things get a lot more nuanced. And the dynamics of whether or not people adopt AI really depends on the user's own preferences. And what's interesting is that the outcomes in these simulations were actually pretty similar to scenarios where there was no media involved at all. Basically, they found that a situation where everyone's cooperating and there's a high level of trust, developers building safe AI, regulators doing their job well, and users feeling confident enough to adopt AI that could be a stable state. But there are a couple of caveats.
Caveats like what?
Well, this trust and cooperation thing can break down if the cost of regulation is just too high, like if it's super expensive for regulators to do their job properly, or if there's always this tiny little advantage to using AI, even if it might be risky. Like if people feel like they're missing out if they don't use AI, even if there's a chance it could backfire, they might just take the risk.
That makes sense. Incentives matter, right? So objective reporting on regulators seems to empower users more than it directly impacts developer behavior. Now let's get to the juicy stuff. What did the study say about what happens when the media, like everyone else in the system, isn't purely objective, but is acting in their own best interest?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. What they found is that whether or not the commentariat decides to put in the work to do that deep investigative reporting really comes down to the balance of incentives. Remember how we talked about the reputational benefit they get for accurate reporting, B set to Z, and the cost to their reputation if they get it wrong, CRE W? Well, the study showed that if the cost of being wrong is low, and the reward for getting it right isn't that high, the media is less likely to do that hard work of investigating. And unfortunately, this can lead to more unsafe AI being developed, because if no one's really digging into what's going on, developers can kind of get away with cutting corners.
It's like the classic if a tree falls in the forest scenario.
Yeah.
If no one's there to report on bad AI, does it even matter? Okay, so we need to make sure the media has a good reason to hold both developers and regulators accountable.
Exactly. The incentives have to be aligned. On the flip side, the study found that when there are strong incentives for accuracy, it can really limit the developer's ability to just ignore safety concerns. Because if they know someone's watching and is likely to call them out for bad behavior, they're more likely to play it safe.
Okay, so how we incentivize the media matters a lot. Did they find any difference in whether it's more effective for the media to focus on investigating the developers or the regulators? I mean, both seem important.
Yeah, that was a big part of what they were looking at. So when the media puts its energy into investigating the developers, really looking under the hood at how they're building AI, the study suggests that this can act as a kind of soft regulation, like we talked about. It can actually lead to developers prioritizing safety and ultimately more users feeling comfortable adopting AI, even if there isn't super strong formal regulation in place.
That's pretty powerful. So the media can really step in and fill the gaps when formal regulation is lacking.
They can. But, and there's always a but in these complex systems, how effective this is really depends on how expensive that investigation is for the media. Remember that cost we called CI? If it takes a ton of resources to do that kind of in-depth reporting, well, the media might not be able to do it as much. So there's a tipping point where the cost of investigating outweighs the potential benefit.
Makes sense. Resources are always limited. What about when the media focuses its attention on the regulators? Does that have a similar effect?
It's a little different. When the commentariat acts as a watchdog on the regulators, holding them accountable, the study suggests that this mostly reinforces the need for strong, formal, hard regulation. It doesn't necessarily replace it in the same way that focusing on developers can.
Interesting. So shining a light on the regulators is important, but it doesn't necessarily lessen the need for rules and enforcement. It seems like these two roles of the media really complement each other. Okay, now I want to circle back to those LLM simulations. You said they use AI agents to play out these interactions. What were some of the things they learned from those simulations? And did the results line up with what their game theory models predicted?
The LLM simulations were fascinating. They provided some really interesting insights, some of which confirmed what the game theory models predicted, and some that were a little unexpected. For example, the simulation showed that pretty consistently, the users, that's us, we tend to go for AI whenever we think there's even a small advantage to doing so, even if there's some risk involved. This lines up with the assumption in the model that the benefit of using even slightly unsafe AI, that epsilon factor, is greater than zero. People are generally optimistic about AI and are willing to take a bit of a gamble if they think it will benefit them.
So, we're a hopeful bunch. What else did the simulations reveal?
Well, another thing that lined up with the game theory predictions was that the commentariat, the media folks in the simulation, were more likely to do those in-depth investigations when the reputational reward for being right, that B factor, was high. So again, incentives matter.
It's like those AI agents were reading the game theory textbook. Was there any surprises from the simulations, or did they play out exactly as expected?
There were definitely some interesting deviations. For example, the game theory model often predicted that regulators would act less cooperatively, meaning maybe be a bit lax in their enforcement when they were being scrutinized by the media. And in Model 1 of the simulations, where the media was focused on developers, that's exactly what happened. But in Model 2, where the media was watching the regulators, things went a little differently. The AI agents representing the developers in that simulation were actually more likely to act in their own self-interest, meaning build less safe AI, than the game theory model predicted. It's like they knew they could get away with more when the regulators were distracted.
Oh, sneaky AI agents. What else was different?
Another interesting thing they found was that the specific type of LLM they used mattered. They used GPT-based models, which you've probably heard of, and another type called Mistral. And what they noticed was that the GPT models tended to generate more cooperative behavior from the commentariat compared to the Mistral models. So even the AI simulating the media had different personalities in a way.
That's so cool. It's like each AI model brings its own biases to the table, just like humans do. Okay, now I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the cost of investigation for the media. You said that this is a really crucial factor in all of this. Can you remind us why that is?
Of course. So you remember that cost of investigation, CIA? Well, the study really highlighted how crucial that is for the whole AI governance system to work well. If it costs a ton of money, time, and expertise for the media to do those in-depth investigations, to really get to the bottom of how AI is being developed and regulated, well, they're just less likely to do it. And that means less accountability, more opportunity for unsafe AI to slip through the cracks, and ultimately, less trust from users.
So it's not just about having a free press. It's about making sure the press has the resources to do its job well, especially when it comes to something as complex as AI.
Exactly. It's like you can't expect good reporting to just magically appear. It takes investment. And the study authors actually argue that supporting investigative journalism, especially when it comes to AI, is a key part of building a trustworthy AI ecosystem.
Agreed. Information is power, and good information is crucial for making informed decisions about AI. Now, the paper also talked a lot about transparency. What kind of transparency were they advocating for?
They made a really important point about transparency. You know how there's a lot of talk about making AI algorithms themselves transparent, like being able to understand how they make decisions? Well, this study argues that it's equally important to have transparency around the practices of the people developing AI and what the regulators are actually doing. So it's not just about knowing how the AI works, it's also about knowing how it's made and how it's governed. This ties back to what we were saying about users needing good information to make informed decisions about trust. It's a three-pronged approach to transparency: AI systems themselves, the developers who build them, and the regulators who oversee them.
Transparency across the board. I like it. And as we've talked about, the media plays a huge role in making all that happen.
They really do. And whether they focus on investigating developers, which can lead to that soft regulation, or on keeping an eye on the regulators, which tends to reinforce the need for formal, hard regulation,
Yeah.
both those roles are crucial for building a healthy AI ecosystem.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into a pretty complex topic.
Yeah.
What would you say is the biggest takeaway for our listeners? If they only remember one thing from this whole discussion, what should it be?
I think the key takeaway is that creating a world where we can all trust AI isn't simple. It's not just about writing some rules and hoping for the best. It's a dynamic, evolving system where incentives, information, and the actions of different players, including us, all interact. And the media, those folks who report on all this, they play a vital role in shaping how all of this unfolds.
Right. So next time you're reading or watching something about AI, take a moment to think about who's telling you that information, what their motivations might be, and whether they have the resources to really dig deep and get the full story. Because that, more than anything, is what will determine if the AI we end up with is truly trustworthy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think this whole conversation brings up another important question that I'll leave our listeners to ponder. As AI gets more and more powerful and integrated into our lives, how can we make sure the systems around it, the media, the watchdogs, all the ways we get information about AI are as robust and reliable as the technology itself? That's something we all need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. Food for thought. Well, thanks for bringing this research to our attention. Always a pleasure to have you on the deep dive.
Always happy to be here.
Until next time, folks, keep diving deep and stay curious.